Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today. The subject that we are looking at today, the global economy, the challenges of emerging nationalism, I think it's a particularly relevant topic given what we've seen with the United States in the last 1 year, the fact that rates have been raised so many times, the fact that at the moment we see a great deal of tension between China and the United States, the trade war, as it were, is a constant concern. Over here in Europe, we've got concerns over Brexit as well. How does this impact billions of people across the world? Where do emerging economies, for example, stand as a result of all of this? Or is this threat, is the word threat perhaps a wrong word? Is it all hyped? Do we need to look at the issue of nationalism perhaps in a different manner? That yes, there will always be nationalistic interests, but the basic fundamental nature of the global system hasn't really changed. To discuss all of these, we've got a wonderful panel. To my left, Professor Robert Chiller, the Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale, a Nobel laureate, one of the finest minds in the world in several of these areas. Professor Raghuram Rajan, a lot of us over here from India would know him as the last RBI governor, distinguished service professor of finance at University of Chicago at the moment. Gary Reeder, the global head of clients and markets at KPMG, on the far side, as it were, and Marietta Schaake, member of the European Parliament from the Netherlands. Professor Rajan, let me come to you first. Just a couple of days back, you had Geeta Gopinath of the IMF basically say that the trade scenario is the trade war, as it were, is a potential threat to global growth. The IMF has brought down its growth projections. Do you believe that this is a threat that's going to remain for the foreseeable future?
I think we will see some kind of a deal between the United States and China over the next couple of months. My sense is both sides feel that it is necessity, there is a necessity to declare a truce, but I think it'll only be a truce. That the deeper differences between the two countries will take time to iron out. Really, we have a clash between the US and China on who occupies pole position in the global economy, and how the institutions that govern the global economy, the multilateral institutions, are going to change. And of course, this is as much a clash about the economics as it is ultimately a strategic and a military clash. So I think the issues go much beyond trade. We will see, some agreement. It may have some elements of, how do we monitor intellectual property, whether you will allow FDI without people having to enter into joint ventures and so on. But will it deal with the fundamental tensions between the two countries? I'm skeptical that one agreement can do that.
Yeah.
So we may see the clouds lifted, but I think to see them entirely go away is probably over-optimistic.
Yeah. Professor Chiller, in fact, I was going to refer to some of the other tensions between China and the United States. It's as Professor Rajan mentioned, a fight for pole position in a sense. If you look at the South China Seas, the fact that the United States and China have very differing perceptions, the huge militarization of the Pacific Ocean, the United States turning its attention to the Indo-Pacific region. This is where China and the United States now stand. So therefore, in as much as both countries require each other from an economic standpoint, isn't this battle going to, in a sense, define the foreseeable future?
Well, I haven't thought that way. The South China Sea issue hasn't really I don't think about it. We don't think about it that much. It doesn't seem like a crisis situation, although of course it is a violation of international law. So I don't feel so pessimistic. The trade issue, of course, is an immediate problem. First of all, it's disruptive to leave people with uncertainty about what the tariff structure is. That slows down business decisions immediately. In the longer run, it's disruptive again for reasons that Adam Smith talked about more than 200 years ago. But on the other hand, it might lead to some solving of problems. There's a complaint about intellectual property theft that's not original with Trump. It was under the Obama administration. There were complaints to the WTO about that too. Mm-hmm. So if it leads to intellectual property is a fundamental driver of economic growth. So there could be an upside to it.
All right. Gary, how do you see it as somebody who deals with the markets, surveys the markets, looks at this from that standpoint? Are we, at the one level, we've had problems in in emerging markets, for example, the direct linkage to a growing U.S. economy, the Fed rates being hiked, but that's stabilized a lot more. The prognosis is that even countries like Turkey and Argentina, which have faced strife over the last 1 year, would be somewhat better. India is projected to do reasonably well. So therefore, how do you actually see, let's talk a little bit about emerging markets. The threat of nationalism in the US, does it really pose that much of a challenge to emerging markets?
Well, from the travels I go on, the difference I've noticed with the US-China issue is actually the ASEAN, the Asia-Pacific, looking for how what's their strategy for China. I think in prior visits, it was much more the influence of the US and the interaction with the US.
Yeah.
So I think that is a noticeable change, and I'm surprised quite how quickly that has come about, actually. I mean, generally, the clients I deal with don't like the US-China situation. They see it as a threat. I think your optimism is not something I've seen in other clients that I've spoken to. I think they see it, and I think the interesting thing as well, it's not just about trade. It's about IP, it's about technology, it's about data, it's about many other things rather than just trade. And I think we're in a world now that rather that the countries look for a solution that benefits all, there's got to be a winner and loser in each of these scenarios, and that's what troubles me, and I think troubles organizations too, that who's going to win and who's going to lose. You can't see people compromising and coming to a win-win in these kind of situations, and I think that's a concern, and it's certainly a concern of my clients.
Professor Rajan, is it a worry that some of the rhetoric that we see from the United States, from Trump specifically, is dangerous? For example, if you look at Turkey, a country which is trying to emerge economically from the problems which they faced and are, in a sense, struggling to do that. If you have the US president tweeting, and I quote, the US will devastate Turkey economically if Ankara decides to attack Kurdish groups in Syria. How does this help?
Look, there is a language of international discourse that people are used to, and certainly President Trump doesn't adhere to that language. My sense is people adjust to that new language. I think the greater concern is not so much the language, but the process of US policy making, and whether the structures that are in place to create deliberate policy sometimes are broken down by these kinds of statements, observations. If you recollect, a few weeks ago, President Trump announced that the US was withdrawing from Syria. And of course, since then, we've seen some pretty strong backpedaling from the administration. So I think it creates a certain amount of uncertainty about what truly is on the minds of US policymakers, which is why typically presidents are hesitant to go ahead of the pack. But I think also the recipients tend to adjust for the fact that they've gotten used to a different kind of language from President Trump.
Yes, some of them have started ignoring that as well.
I don't think
yes.
we ever get completely used to that kind of language. The thing that bothered me the most about Trump is when he used the words fire and fury with regard to North Korea. Now, it is North Korea, which is provocative then, but no one should ever use language like that, because people won't forget that. And they can't take that kind of threat into, they can't learn to say, oh, that's just the way he talks.
Well, let's just hope it's rhetoric and nothing more substantial than that. Mariette, if we just focus a little bit on Europe and the entire Brexit situation, that's nationalism at another level. Some would call it bizarre nationalism. But it still represents a threat, not just to Europe, but I think the signals, and economically there could be linkages to other economies as well. How do you see that as a real problem going forward for economies around the world?
So I think in Europe we are now faced with the UK in frankly, a political chaos. And we've talked about President Trump, we talked about trade wars, and I think all of this boils down to questions of governance and political leadership. And in the case of Brexit, I have hardly ever seen more irresponsible political brinkmanship, as we've seen from Prime Minister Cameron, who, of course, has long abandoned the scene, and the consequences are still there for the people. And I think the sadness is not only that the UK is leaving, because it's a lose-lose, I believe, for Europe and the UK, but also that the people who voted for Brexit will suffer the most from its consequences. And I can only hope that the lessons of Brexit, all of them, questions about political leadership and the absence of it, articulation of what could happen in the case of Brexit, which was really absent. We were discouraged as European politicians from getting engaged because we were presumed to be poor messengers for what European cooperation means. And now we can see letters in British newspapers every day from Germans, maybe the Dutch tomorrow, the French the day after, saying, we will miss you. We care about our relationship, not only economically, strategically, for security reasons, but people to people. The Brits were part of the allies that liberated our continent. That is a deeply felt connection, not only through modern day relations, but really also historically. So I think there are a lot of lessons learned, but it has also changed the dynamic for the rest of the EU 27 member states, where I see profoundly more leadership in terms of multilateralism, rules-based trade, which is what I believe this is all about. Yeah. It is about not only having rules of fairness on the books, but also a perception of fairness among the people, about the redistribution of the macroeconomic benefits that trade can bring if it's done well, and how it trickles down. So I'm a big believer in Europe stepping into the void that America leaves under Trump, and working with partners that are like-minded, such as India. I really believe there's an extraordinary opportunity, and I hope you all see it too, for closer cooperation between India and the EU. And I hope that there will be also leadership coming from India towards that, because in a time of geopolitical clashes and repositioning of great global powers, we cannot overlook the significance of India as a democracy and as a potentially stronger player in this whole space.
I think those comments are very welcome to a large Indian group over here. Gary, just taking off from where what Marietta was speaking, when we talk about nationalism and redefining nationalism, and we talk about blocs, and we talk about the United States and their goals, we often tend to criticize the United States. But if you look at the other countries, for example, India, which is actively part of a bloc which some would call an evolving military bloc, with the United States, with Australia, with Japan as well, encountering the growing strategic presence of China, we could be entering a phase where economically the future is quite risky. So it's not just about nationalism in America, it's also about the belief in nationalism in so many areas. India, for example.
Well, definitely, and as the only Brit on the panel, I could not agree more with what you just said, and it breaks my heart every day to see what is happening there. I think to your question, I think that we focus on Brexit, we focus on the US. You see this topic, and you hone in on Trump, and you hone in on Brexit. I think there are many other things that are maybe not byproducts, not the right word, but are similar. You look at the governments in Poland, in Hungary. We've mentioned Turkey already. Look what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in Mexico. Everywhere populism is taking hold, and the instability that's creating, I think, is significant. And I think why it's more significant is because the US is withdrawing. We do a lot of work with an organisation called Eurasia that many may know. Ian Bremmer's been much visible here in the past. And he talks of his G0 world, that actually a lot of the instability is because US is backing away from its prior role as sort of global policeman. So you've got these populist developments at the same time as sort of US is withdrawing in terms of its, I said, this role that it took part in the place. So I think all of that is a cocktail of great instability, actually, and just perpetuates, I think, the populist view.
Yeah. Professor Rajan, one of China's big efforts has been the Belt and Road Initiative. They say that it's not anything but an economic effort at reaching out to countries ultimately all over the world, but certainly initially in Asia. Be that as it may, India, for example, has lots of problems with that. We believe that it affects our sovereignty because of where the road physically lies or goes through what we call Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. These divergent views exist. So how exactly does one, for example, the world's largest democracy, India, and a country like China overcome these? Because both have nationalist interests.
Right. Look, I think the emergence of populism in the West creates an opportunity because we are moving to a multipolar world, at least economically. And certainly, from the perspective of defense, the US is still by far and large the strongest army and defense forces in the world, but China is catching up, and of course, as far as numbers go, there are other countries that are closing in. The broader point is that the world was made with the United States at its center post-World War II. The Allies came together and created multilateral institutions which would essentially give the US veto power. But the US was accepted because in a sense it was the largest and the most powerful country in the world, but also it rarely exercised that power. It was a very benign hegemony, if you will. And these organizations flourished. We got global trade. The rise of China in part was facilitated by the United States. The problem today, however, is that we still have those institutional structures, but we haven't adapted for the fact that now there are a number of countries knocking on the door. And we have to have a new rules-based system which doesn't necessarily give the US that central power, but acknowledges that Europe is big, the US is big, China is big, eventually India and Brazil will also be big players, and their role has to be recognized in these institutions. Now, in fact, we've got the opposite. We have the US, as you said, backing off, but unwilling to relinquish its hold over these institutions. In fact, what we've seen with the World Bank presidency opening up is they want to put a US person, regardless, even though there is no strong belief in multilateralism in this administration. And that's to my mind playing into this, where a situation where China says, okay, if they won't let us in, we're going to create our own separate structures. And we're going to challenge the existing structures by working outside. And there is already talk that the Asian Investment Bank that China has created actually rolls out loans faster and in a more effective way than the ADB or the World Bank. And so, my mind, if we don't have a change in these, we will get more of the world that China makes.
Right.
And
But talk about Belt and Road, if you will, because it's a huge initiative.
Well,
and it's problematic at so many levels.
Well, it is. So it has so many objectives. It has so many sides to it. If you see it from the perspective of some of the countries for which they've had successful projects financed, China is providing finance that's not available elsewhere. If you see it from the perspective of Sri Lanka, which gives up its port, or Pakistan, which today a number of Pakistanis feel aggrieved that there's so much sort of Pakistani debt for projects that seem to be privileged to the Chinese. I think the Chinese certainly are trying to expand both their economic influence as well as to some extent the political influence. But I think it would be better for them and for the world if this was done in a more multilateral setting. And the problem with the Belt and Road is right now it's been seen, for whatever the changes, it's been seen as a Chinese initiative. It was seen as more a multilateral initiative. It would benefit them. That requires cooperation from the West. It requires a recalculation of the institutions.
Professor Scheller, I read an interesting question in an editorial, and it goes back to the United States and where Trump's policies may or may not lie. I'm going to read it out. Are Trump's policies a negotiating tactic for a better trade deal, or is it in fact a long-term effort at changing the global status quo? What's he doing?
Well, I don't know that he knows where he's going, but he is good at judging audiences. And so at this point in time, as in many other countries, there are a lot of people who felt that their economic status, especially rural people, has diminished. And so he talks about putting tariffs that will revive the coal mining industry or the steel industry. That sounds like a long-term policy. But whether he thinks of it as long-term, I don't know. I don't know that he thinks that far ahead.
All right, I'm going to change focus to another big issue, and Marietta, if you can help me out on this, which has come up at the World Economic Forum, sustainable development. If you go through the global risk report of WEF, it's interesting because in the immediate impacts that they're looking at and in the long-term impacts at number 2, it's all about climate change. This was not the case, say, 10 years back, when the focus of WEF in terms of risks being identified was linked to trade and other issues. The reason I bring this up in this context is because when we talk about nationalism and the US versus China versus India and other nations, we forget about something that brings us all together in a bad way. Isn't this essentially the big link, the environment that needs to bring countries together?
Oh, it absolutely should be. It absolutely should be, and I believe we need to be humble in the most developed nations, like the European countries, because frankly, if all people in the world would like to have the level of consumption that our citizens have, the problems would exacerbate massively. I was in Delhi last week and I was already shocked now by the levels of pollution. I know it's a cliche, but it's really tangible and it's problematic for children growing up there and for them to develop, into healthy adults, etc. So we definitely have to find solutions, and we need to see leadership. So I'm happy that, for example, the European Union has decided not to engage in trade agreements with countries that do not sign up to the climate agreement, the Paris agreements, for example. So I believe, and this is also, I think, a good way to look at trade and trade agreements and trade rules. It's not static. We can guide it into the direction that we believe we need to go as we learn about the threats to humanity, to our biodiversity, to sustainability, etc., our water quality, our air quality. We need to also leverage our economic and political way towards achieving these higher standards. I mean, we don't think about production the same way that we did 100 years ago. What we thought was acceptable 100 years ago in terms of what jobs people had, but also the health risks involved, we don't find acceptable again or anymore today. And I believe we need to go much further in using new technologies and new insights from science, new facts that we've learned to actually steer our own behavior in a better direction.
Yeah. Gary, would you like to come in on this? The fact that a lot of people would, in the developing world, particularly in countries like India and Pakistan, to a lesser extent Bangladesh, would say that, look, we have misplaced priorities if we are talking about nationalism when we don't have the political will to change anything in terms of the environment. You visited Delhi, I live in Delhi.
Yeah,
I've got, Marietta, 2 kids both on the nebulizer. And this is the way it is every single winter, right, without change. The first line of treatment for children in New Delhi by the best pediatricians is often, right, I see, let's move to mild nebulizing. This is, in Europe, for example, very much a last course of treatment.
Yeah.
So my question actually to you, Gary, is, are we missing the boat in terms of what we need to be looking at if you're talking about real nationalism, where people are affected?
Yeah, well, I think your point about being the developed world needs to be more humble about this. If you're actually going to solve this, it's very easy, isn't it? India has obviously signed the Paris Accord, but that threat and that need to, when you've got real children struggling, that brings it home how serious this is and how critical, it needs to be resolved. I struggle though with because any of the solutions that are talked about they're long term, aren't they? They're not going to resolve the child who's ill now. I mean, one of the other angles that I get involved in conversations around is if you like, corporations' role in this. So companies use fuel, they create obviously the issues that are manifesting here. So, finding ways to, within the financial markets, to give credit to those corporations that pursue more attractive climate-related approaches versus those who don't. Again, it's a small step, but it's a step in the right direction. So I think business has a role to play here as well. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to add one thing which I forgot to say, very much related to nationalism. Because one thing is for sure, these problems cannot be solved by single nations alone.
Yeah.
And anyone who's promising that is lying to the people, and I think that is irresponsible. So that's one thing I think is really important. The second thing that I want to flag here for those who are not following the debates in Europe in great detail is that I worry that the debate about climate change and tackling it and taking responsibility in the most developed countries is becoming a discussion of class. It's becoming a discussion of who can and who cannot afford the consequences of measures that need to be taken to protect the environment. So for governments, this is another very big challenge, to convince people to take difficult measures that are seen to be, which I don't think they have to, and I think there's many ways to address it, but seen to be framed to be also by the nationalists as an attack on poor people who are going to be taxed for isolating their homes and saving energy, or who are going to have to pay more for meat consumption, for example. So we really have to be mindful of the inequality debate merging with the climate change debate in developing countries, and very much becoming a tool for nationalists, which will stagnate progress in addressing these very urgent issues even more.
I think one of, and this is my last set of questions before we go across to a handful of questions from you. Global inequality, that's such a key part. And let me ask you this, just a few days back, Oxfam released its Global Inequality Report. Here we are talking about high nationalism. We're talking about the great wealth of China and the United States and the way forward there and their geostrategic concerns. But aren't we forgetting that in this environment, in a place as rich as Davos, we sometimes miss the point about how the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. This has been statistically backed up. The number of billionaires, for example, in India has gone up tremendously. But if you look at the proportionate availability of wealth, the poor in a country like India, and this is true all across the world, is just a fraction of what the rich earn. Isn't this the biggest problem when it comes to nationalism?
It is a defining problem for our age. And the problem is that the history of governments shows that they don't readily, in the past, take actions against rising inequality. So there was a book a few years ago by Shiv and Stasavage that looked at, I think, 20 countries extending as far back as 200 years with data on inequality. And they tested the hypothesis that countries will be more redistributive. They'll raise the taxes on the rich and redistribute to the poor if inequality gets worse. But what they found out was that isn't true at all. For a wide array of countries, they do nothing to alleviate inequality. What happens? So how is it that we have high taxes on the rich in some places? It happens because of war, according to them. It's always the same story. We're fighting a war, men are dying, your rich people have to contribute to this effort. And the rich have no ability to stop it then. They're morally obligated to. So they raise taxes during the war, and then they slowly let taxes decline. But it takes years for them to go back down on the rich. So given that pattern, we have to find some way of changing this pattern. So I have a small proposal that was in my book, Finance and the Good Society. I think governments now should be making plans for what to do in the future. I'm talking like 10, 20 years in the future, if inequality gets worse. So we have to define some threshold of inequality and then specify that the tax will then put heavy taxes on the rich. You can't say like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the new young hero in the U.S., said, let's just put a 70% tax on the rich. It'll never fly. You have to, I'm thinking, this is my hope, that if we put it into the future as contingent on some disaster, it's possible that we could make a fix like this. Otherwise, we're just not going to solve the problem.
Fascinating thoughts. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not convinced, but I'm not an economist, so bear with me, but in our country, we actually have a very progressive tax system where the richest bracket pays more than half of their income on tax. And there is relatively low unemployment, for example, yet nationalism and populism are on the rise.
Or in France.
Or in France. Well, in France they have a lot of systematic problems that have not been tackled the way in which we have. So, for example, we work 5 years longer than the French. Our pension age is 67, French pension age is 62, just to give one example, but their government expenses need to be reformed. The point is, though, that I think we have to, of course, look at the well-being of everyone in society, and you always have to cater more to the people that need it most. But my sense is that there's also something in the question of relative progress or relative decline. In absolute terms, many people in China are much worse off than they are in Europe, but they feel that they have the wind in their backs, that they're moving in the right direction. Same in Turkey for a long time. They struggle now, but for the last decade, many people in Turkey felt like they were going towards greater progress. In Europe, we've seen decades of almost automatic increase of wealth and prosperity after World War II, roughly speaking, and that is now questioned. It's not even definitively challenged, but it's questioned, and that creates fear. So my sense is that this relative position vis-a-vis the past and the future is also a factor that we have to be concerned about, and that politicians need to be honest about, because if you have an aging population, fewer people paying into a pension system, then you cannot expect the same kind of figures to go on. Right. We had baby boomers, my parents' generation, many of them born after the war, that are now living longer. We're super happy with that. Our parents are with us for a longer period of time, but it also means we have to pay for their pensions for a longer period of time. And I believe people understand this, really, but they're hardly ever told the truth. It's easier for many politicians to blame immigrants, to blame China, to blame the trade war or Trump or what have you, to find a victim instead of taking ownership of this product of our own society in some ways. So I believe that's
taxation,
part
I
of
think,
the
as the professor suggests, is something we need to look at closely, but to what extent is that feasible is the law. I think those points are very, very valid, and I'd like to just open up the panel because we're running out of time now. Look at lots of hands. Why don't you go ahead, sir, right in the front, and I'll come to you in a little while. But why don't you go ahead, sir? Yes.
Krishna, I have,
Just 1 second, you can pass the mic on to you.
question to all of you, yes. Last year was a disaster.
No, on.
You got to put it on, I think,
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Last year was a disaster for all the markets. I mean, from stock markets to cryptos to everything, and all of those were not linked to the performance of companies in any way. Companies were performing fantastically well, and somebody tweets, somebody sneezes, somebody China trade war, and all this stuff which has no absolute relation to your company's performance. How can we curb this, this careless, callous, and irresponsible and attitude of politicians or actors for whom they suffer no consequences, but the businesses are, suffer, and then, for example, the consequences are really very bad because in India, for example, Indian markets, many IPOs didn't come out.
Sure.
And it's capital raising is a
So
concern.
what specifically is your question?
How can we this be dealing sort of, how can the politicians or others irresponsible behavior be dealing from, businesses impact?
So, I mean, to the question that you raised in this question, I mean, if you think of the long-term solution to aging societies, it means not robots, but actually immigration. Robots are not going to be the answer.
Right.
It also means that because demand domestically will be weaker, the emerging markets will be where you target your exports. It's the worst possible solution today when you have an aging society to act both against immigration as well as to elevate tariffs, because what you do to them today, they will do to you tomorrow. So in that sense, I think to your point, we are not thinking long term. We're not even thinking about what the effects of these policies will have across markets. Anybody who thinks long term will have to believe that for the aging societies of the West, an integrated world with some immigration, controlled no doubt, but some controlled immigration has to be the answer. And you would start preparing your societies for that. That's not happening. That's not even being talked about. Immigration is a problem, not a solution. Trade is a problem, not a solution. of course, I mean, this varies country by country, but I'm just bringing out
It
some of the
varies
broad
politician
populist.
by politician
Eh,
too. I think that's
politician by
important. It's a
politician.
real battle.
Exactly. But and this is where I think the inequality issue that Bob pointed out has to also be taken into account. That we don't face these problems together as a country. We face it as a divided set of things. Some people bear more of the brunt, other people get more of the benefits. So we, even as we think of these as potential solutions, we also have to make sure that it's win-win across various segments of society. That, to my mind, is the single biggest challenge. How do you make those gilets jaunes believe that, in fact, climate change is their enemy also? Mm-hmm. How do you make them believe that there is opportunity in trade? And I think this requires a revisiting of government, not looking at the aggregate, but looking at how it affects specific communities, specific localities. And that's the change we need.
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Bhavin from Avada Power. Sir, we fully agree, everybody here, on the impact of climate change that is going to happen, but very little has been done apart from depending on multilaterals or aids from various governments. So my question is to Professor Rajan as to what needs to be done by central banks and by government to channelize private sector investment, because for India itself, for achieving our solar targets or renewable targets, we require $100 billion. And the way the state is going on, in terms of the banking sector or the equity money coming in, what needs to be done instead of just agreeing to the problem that climate change needs to be dealt with, but what needs to be done to
Sure.
what's the solution to it?
Well, I think government, we should get somebody else to talk about. I certainly think on the part of central banks or even regulators, the way you can encourage action on climate change is really to define the limitations of investment in polluting technologies today. So, for example, you can say that coal has the problem that 10, 15 years from now, we will find that this is really too expensive from a climatic perspective to continue with. So there's a great risk in investing in coal in a very big way. Of course, in India, we have the big problem that this is our single biggest energy source. Mm-hmm. The question is, what kind of a medium-term plan can we put into place such that we don't invest tremendous amounts in this asset which is likely to become stranded, but instead move towards renewable sources for which India is actually making a substantial amount of investment.
Yeah. Right.
Yes, Professor.
I was just thinking, the problem with climate change is, of course, a free rider problem. Every country wants to be the one that doesn't comply. How do you solve that problem? One important idea was the recent Nobel Prize winner this year in economics, William Nordhaus. He wrote an article, it was his presidential address before the American Economic Association, called Climate Clubs. What he was basically saying is, here is a place for tariff policy. You isolate the countries that are not complying on climate change, and force them to pay higher tariffs. I can't think of a better proposal to deal with the.
But haven't we done pretty much the opposite? I mean,
Well,
we have
maybe.
outsourced production oftentimes where, the climate consequences are moved elsewhere. Think about meat production for the United States in Latin America. Think about deindustrialization of many countries, which, has its own domestic problems. But when you look at it purely from a climate point of view, it is also outsourced the pollution. And so I think we also have to show more of a comprehensive thinking about our own role vis-a-vis developing
You
countries.
say we have to, but how do you make that happen?
So, I think when it comes to sharing knowledge about this and indeed incentivizing compliance with higher climate standards, I think you can do it through trade, for sure, by giving, advantages.
But let me just jump in over here. While that is exactly the way that world over we need to be tackling climate change and pollution, we have a fundamental problem in, for example, my country, the world's largest democracy. Pollution is not a political issue. People do politics and win elections on entirely different grounds. Even though 1 in 8 people dying in India die of air pollution. This is a statistical fact. It's coming out now.
Yeah.
In the past, I mean, people die, they die of a heart attack, they die of a stroke, they die of other ailments. But the linkage between air pollution and that is coming out now. Is any political party in India going into the elections in a few months raising this as a political issue? Why is this not the world's biggest political issue? So the point that I'm trying to make over here is that we all believe we need to improve the environment, but we end up just killing ourselves because nobody is willing to do anything. People are used to living with this horror. It's the way it's quote unquote always been. But it's how does one change that mindset? It's not just education of children. It has to be a political effort. And politicians need to understand that. If they don't, then we all die. Unfortunately, in India, that's the way it is. Our lifespans are suffering.
Yes.
And that's a problem of a democracy. In China, which isn't quite as democratic as India, they fought pollution in Beijing. They fought pollution in Shanghai through very harsh initiatives. Here we can't shut down basic industries. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that there are different strokes for different folks. And unfortunately in India, none of these strokes appear to be working. It's not a political issue. No one cares. Any other questions? We've got time for exactly two. Yes.
One
Oh,
question.
you go ahead. Sorry,
Sorry.
I meant to come to you.
So, some form of economic nationalism always existed, and let's be honest that this is not something new. After 2008, a large number of countries, including India, corrected their inverted duty structures.
Yes.
Which means we reduced the customs duties on spares and components, increased it on imported products. That was economic nationalism to promote manufacturing. But when that happened, the customs duties on imports went up for all countries, not for a targeted country. So my question is harmonized nationalism, economic nationalism, which is harmonized, not a better demon to manage than country targeted nationalism, whether it is India, China, or US, China, or Brazil, Israel, or so on?
Gary, would you like to
Well, it
target?
comes
You've been
back to
sitting
it.
silent for a while.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, you will see, a number of events I've been to here have been talking in terms of trade, actually the reduction in trade as technology enables more to be done localized, so more to be done where the customer is. So you don't need as much, what we've been talking about, you could see reduce, because actually you can do more where the customer is, which kind of is a bit like your harmonized nationalism. I like that term because, as I mentioned earlier, my concern is the way things are going at the moment, there has to be a winner and a loser every time. And as long as that exists, you're never going to reach a place which is a win-win, which I think someone mentioned earlier, what's been effectively the post-war, led by the US as being the US was happy to help and support Europe in the main, and others too, emerging markets to grow, and all benefited. But now we're in Putin versus West, Erdogan versus you. Everyone is pitted against each other, and it's someone has to win and someone has to lose. And I worry about that, and how until you change that dynamic, I struggle to see how you can get to your perfect world, if you like. Yeah.